We know in the next century that human numbers are not continuing to increase exponentially, and that's a lucky thing. This new symbiosis with technology is going to look quite different from the Industrial Revolution's one, which is all about just, harnessing industrial energy and getting us out of a Malthusian state. We're already not in a Malthusian state anymore, the overwhelming majority of humans today. In not very long, there are going to be many, many more AIs than people. That's kind of just around the corner. So we're looking at, if you think about all of, people and AIs, both as nodes in a graph with all kinds of relations between them, the people are the rarer, objects in that graph in the near future. I don't think a lot of people have really thought about that and its implications, because we're still imagining that, one AI per person is kind of the limit, in the same sense that people were imagining that one computer per person had to be the limit, in 1980.
This is Dan Fagelli. You're tuned in to The Trajectory. And in this episode is our 14th of the Worthy Successor series. Our guest this week is Blaise Agüera y Arcas, who is a vice president, a Google fellow, and also the CTO of Technology Society at Google, which is a pretty cool title for someone working in this field. Blaise has a lot of very strong ideas around symbiosis and the future of intelligence. We talk sometimes of the blaze of life or the great process of life of which we are part. I don't know if I've ever heard it clicked together in terms of Lego pieces, in terms of where this bubbling up of life comes from and where it goes to, quite as well as I did in this episode. And there's a lot to reflect on Blaise's particular vision around where symbiosis takes us, including some areas of agreement and disagreement. But overall, there's hardly an episode I've had more fun recording. So I hope you enjoy this one. Without further ado, I'll save my comments for the end of the episode as usual. This is Blaise Agüera y Arcas here on The Trajectory. Blaise, welcome to The Trajectory.
Thanks so much, Dan. It's really good to be here.
Yeah, I have been looking forward to this conversation since our first little chat there, and many people recommending that I dig into your work, and I'm glad that I did. We're going to open with the first big question. I think this is going to be kind of a water slide into the greater pool of Blaise-related concepts that I think will be fun. The way I normally ask it is, if you could look down as a transparent eyeball, in a million years or however many years, and maybe there's no distinguishably human, it's not like nobody's walking their dog, nobody's going fishing. There's not that kind of life. But whatever you see is like rich, complex, and you would say, wow, this feels like a win. Like this process that we were a part of, like it actually feels like it kind of won. Like this is good. What would have to be happening for you to say that?
It's a great question. And honestly, if I were only able to see that endpoint, if you like, or that moment in time, without anything in between, then my only sort of indicator of, is stuff going well is it rich? Is it complex? Is it interesting? Is it varied? Does it look like a thriving ecology? The question of like, how much continuity does that have with us, with what we are today, is a question that you could only answer by looking at all of the intermediate times too, and seeing whether there was any tragedy along the way.
Yeah. So I guess the complexity, you used a good analogy here of sort of like, does it look like a thriving ecology? Yeah. I have a mental image of what that means. And I think many people tuned in can think of the economy. They can think of the marshland behind their house somewhere. And they sort of have a notion of what ecology means in a kind of grander cosmic scale beyond, the domain you and I inhabit. Sparkle our minds a bit with what that could look like, or maybe you would hope it could bubble into.
Yeah. Well, in a way, maybe I'll try and approach this from a slightly different perspective, which is that of happiness. When people ask each other, like, what is a good life? What does that mean? What are the requirements? I think a lot of people, who think about this agree that you basically need three things to be happy. You need to have your physical kind of organic needs met. You need to have enough food and, shelter and stuff like this. And you need to have connections with other people. In other words, you need to be important to other people, and other people need to be important to you. And you need to have some sense of efficacy in what you do. In other words, not feel like You could disappear tomorrow. Actually, that one really applies to number 2 and 3. Right?
Yeah.
If I disappeared tomorrow, nothing would be any different. It's not a good feeling.
Yeah.
And an ecology is really just a complex network of entities for which those things are all true. And I see it as a really deep concept that transcends economy, because economy imagines that everything can be boiled down to a single number. That everything is reducible to a price.
Yeah.
And in a real ecology, that's not true. There are a lot of things that are not commensurate with each other. If you don't have oxygen to breathe, it's not like money is going to buy you that. People have, and entities of all kinds have a lot of needs. And a lot of wants and a lot of things that they have to offer to other stuff. And a system that is thriving and is one in which, everything is rich in stuff that is offered by other stuff and is in turn generating wealth in this kind of very multidimensional sense, for others as well.
Yeah. So this is going to start us down, I think, at the right path. Because when you said like, okay, you have physical needs met, you have connections with others, you have efficacy, I started thinking like, well, I don't know if every series of sea snail feeding off of a vent somewhere is like, man, unless I feel the sense of competence, right? Some of these strike me as remarkably hominid-ish, but I think what you're talking about is in a conceptual sense. There is a relationship with the sea snail and a lot of other life. And there are relationships that make more sea snails, of a, probably not a romantic kind, but, they have needs too, I presume. I don't know what it's like to be a sea snail. But yeah, I think what you're saying is, these we feel in this sort of emotional sense because we've had all this cortex bubble up, but all the way down, there's a level of this in all these interactions. Am I following you?
100%. I mean, of course, sea snails aren't self-conscious in all of the ways that we are. They're not able to introspect, about their needs and their sense of efficacy and stuff. Of course not. But what is true is that sea snails are providing, if you like, ecosystem services for other, for other kinds of life and vice versa. And the reason that life holds together, the reason that it persists and that it becomes more complex over time is because of all of those networks of mutual aid.
Yeah.
And so, our feelings about this kind of stuff don't come out of nowhere. They come out of the fact that those high order models are models of reality, of how stuff actually is.
Yeah, I think there's something to be said of, well, these grooves and circuits in the mind that make a sunset appear beautiful and whatnot. Some of that is like, okay, for your ancestors, when there was running water and there was birds chirping and things were green, it was like, you're probably not going to die tomorrow. Like, it was like, there was a sense 100%. Of that. And so there's an arbitrariness, but there's also like you have drives and kind of meta things that are important. You have curiosity. Humans want to climb mountains, invent things, whatever. This is a shooting forth of the same impeti that are spinning forth everything else, except you feel it. The sea snail doesn't feel it. It doesn't write a damn poem about it, but you can. And so I think to your point,
or at least you have a model of yourself feeling it. I mean, I think the sea snail probably does feel those things, but it doesn't reflect on those feelings, if you like.
There we go. No, actually, I completely concur with your correction there. Let me ask, how do you frame this process of which we are part? I mean, there was a time where the sea snail was probably as high as it goes. I mean, that was like, a couple billion years, everything was one cell. And then we started having some more complexity, and then there was some Precambrian stuff and whatever. And it's sort of bubbling up. And there's this, things are meeting needs. Things are interacting with other things. Things are bouncing off of other things. Somehow it's more complicated. And then I hear sometimes the argument, hey, we shouldn't presume that continues. You let something evolve off and it'll just get stupider. Everything's random. It's going in random directions. It doesn't feel as though that's been true. Now, I'm not saying there's an inevitability that all of nature's fecundity leads to a jackpot. It's quite obvious it doesn't, actually. It's quite obvious most of nature's fecundity does the opposite. However, net, the network seems to be doing something here. How do you conceptualize this? You're familiar with the Gaia literature. You think a lot about symbiosis. What should we understand about this process?
Yeah, and you're asking a really deep question, and it really is about evolution's arrow of time, is one way of thinking about it. So if you go back to, kind of classic neo-Darwinian thinking about evolution in the mid-20th century, the idea was that everything is equally evolved. Bacteria and humans, all life has been around for, like It's been evolving for just as long as we have. There's no sense in which any life is more advanced than any other life. To the extent that we see things that are more advanced now, it's kind of an observer bias, or the fact that there's drift and maybe we're looking only at the tail of the distribution. I don't buy that at all. And the reason I don't buy it is because that classic view of Darwinian evolution misses something really important, which is symbiogenesis. The idea that sometimes simple things come together to make more complex things, and those complex things can't arise without the simple things having been there first. So the evolutionary biologists John Maynard Smith and Urs Sathmari wrote about this in a pretty famous Nature paper in 1995. They called it major evolutionary transitions. They listed, I think, 8 of them in their original paper. They've since expanded their list to 12. I actually would take their hypothesis further, but even if we just look at their 12 or so to begin, those transitions are things like individual humans becoming societies, bees and other social insects becoming social from solitary, individual cells becoming multicellular organisms, archaea and bacteria becoming eukaryotes. And what's cool about those transitions is that they result in something that is like discontinuous with what was there before and more complex than what was there before. Like the earlier things are still there, but what they've come together to make is a new kind of entity that is richer. In that sense, evolution absolutely has an arrow of time because, again, like the simpler things have to be there before the more complex thing comes. It's the same with inventions, by the way. I mean, when the light bulb is invented, it's, if you like, a symbiogenesis between the ability to blow glass, to make an electric current, to draw a filament, to make a vacuum. The moment those precursors were there, they were going to be combined, in somebody's mind to make a light bulb. And, lo and behold, they were combined in the minds of at least a dozen people who all invented a light bulb around the same time. There could have been no light bulb without those precursors. And this view of invention, by the way, is one that W. Brian Arthur wrote a really nice book about, back in 2010 or so. But yeah, so this means that there's an arrow of evolution. Things do get more complex, and they get more complex through cooperation. When cooperation becomes close enough that those things cooperating become really tightly interlinked, then you need to kind of zoom out and look at them as a joint entity as well as individuals.
Yeah, we're going to 100% hit this arrow of time that you're talking about. I've never heard that phraseology here. I'm following you, but we're definitely going to go down that rabbit hole. There's a Stuart Kauffman sort of has a bunch of thinking about this stuff around like the degree of sort of unbounded complexity that comes from some things combining, and then they change the whole ecology, and then everything has to adapt to that.
Very closely related idea. Yeah, he calls them Kantian wholes. I agree with his take on this.
Yeah. This kind of, some people say whole on, where like everything is sort of a part, but it's part of a whole, but it's also, unto itself. I mean, you and I obviously are made of individual cells that presumably know not of the conversation you and I are having now. Right. So this arrow of time, it goes up. It goes up, it goes up. It seems to be doing this. And your supposition here is that things come together, and it is often through cooperation. We'll explore that as well, that forms something more complex, which allows for all kinds of other wholes and parts to come into existence. It can combine in a whole bunch of new other ways, and so on and so on. What 100%. Is the tendency that drives this combination? Why does it happen? Some people would say, okay, it happens every now and again, sure. But why is the arrow of evolution, in your words, why is it doing this over and over and over again? Like, what is the attractor here, in your opinion?
Well, I mean, initially, it is a random event. Something random happens that brings two things together. But that may or may not stick. When it sticks is when one of them provides something that the other really wants, and vice versa. In other words, there's mutual benefit. And that mutual benefit leads to greater collective thriving than the two would have on their own. And there are many ways for that to come about. Let's take mitochondria and archaea when they came together to make eukaryotes. So, mitochondria are bacteria, and they're bacteria that are living, inside our cells. And archaea were also, very, very simple single cellular organisms, prokaryotes as well. And somehow, the mitochondrion ended up inside the archaeon, and the whole thing is now supercharged. It's supercharged because the mitochondrion is able to generate energy extremely efficiently inside the environment of the archaea. So it's kind of, one of these things has found a new environment inside the other one that allows it to thrive in a way that is much, in a much more powerful way than it could on its own. There are still bacteria around that look very much like mitochondria. So it's not like the solitaries are gone, but most of the bacteria of that shape are now living inside archaea because that's an incredibly rich environment for them. And the benefit that they give to the archaea is that now the archaea has so much energy that it can reproduce enough DNA, for instance, to develop much greater complexity, and that's why we've got multicellular life and all that kind of stuff. So it allowed many new niches to open up for those eukaryotes too.
So the arrow is indicative of many, things come into being partially through kind of dumb fecundity and accident, maybe through some other impetuses, and then different things can sort of behoove one another in different ways. And when they do, and then they form together, that might be something that's more net capable. And then that opens up new combination surfaces for new things and changes the environment and so on. And that when,
100%.
Yeah. Okay. So,
or take human societies. We've been around for a couple of 100,000 years, right? So our sense of our history is just the most recent little tiny bit, the Holocene, right, of the time that human beings have been around. But for the huge majority of that time, as far as we know, we were living in hunter-gatherer type societies, which where everybody did more or less the same tasks. There wasn't too much division of labor. There wasn't much hierarchy. There wasn't, and life was hard. It's difficult to get into arguments about whose life is better. I mean, there are definitely ways in which hunter-gatherer life was better than, say, the life of a ground down factory worker in the year 1800.
Yeah, I'm with you. Yeah.
So
Okay.
it's a complicated story, but the point is that once we figured out how to start to do division of labor and concentrate in cities, the things that we became capable of as humans just exploded. And, the kind of life of plenty that you and I have now, and not just life of plenty, but a life of plenty such that we can survive in environments that would have been completely inhospitable to our hunter-gatherer forebears, right? Thanks to our division of labor and our technologies and so on. Like it just opens the possibilities up for us, as well as making these larger units, larger social units that didn't exist before.
Yeah. So I like where you're headed for a bunch of reasons. What you're saying is, there is a combination, coordination, cooperation, whatever words we want to use, is sort of the driver here. But I often sincerely dislike the idea that things just love each other and come together. What you're saying is look, it's in the interest of A and B. And when that happens, I'm very much a believer that sort of when you look out at nature, at everything warm and fuzzy, almost it seems ubiquitous that it has a very functional purpose. I believe that. So I'm gonna do a tiny amount of philosophical concept putting on the table, and then just see how you play with those Lego pieces. So Spinoza, who I probably reference too often, but is just intimidatingly important and super smart. Spinoza has this idea of the Conatus. Kind of the core impetus to persist in all organisms, organizations, whatever. And that, he didn't know what an atom was, or the details of a cell, of course. But he doesn't really know what part of the building block it comes up in. And I don't know either. It might be in guanine itself is self-interested in some strange way that you and I can't understand. People say it starts with the gene, but it's I don't know, man, something had to close around a cell. It seems like that impetus is actually deep. So something about the world, wants to persist. And it doesn't seem like granite does that, but it does seem like some stuff does, and it seems like we call it life. Anyway, around the time that Newton said, here's what dead matter does, Spinoza said, here's what living matter does. He wrote the Ethics. And people don't think about it like that, but I often do. He has this idea that potentia is the total set of powers that permit a thing not to die. The total set of powers: flight, sight, verbal communication, the ability to burrow in the dirt, the ability to have feathers, the development of culture where we can teach each other things, technological innovations, this nice microphone, a shovel, whatever the case may be, all is potentia. Anything that is a power that permits a thing to persist is sort of potentia. And his idea is that in order for the Conatus to persist, it's not like, okay, just play defense. The world is too changing. You have to constantly, if you want to persist, nature at some really early stage decided expanding potentia is the way the flame doesn't go out. The flame being non-dead stuff. And it seems as though the grand expanse of said potentia over the last 4 billion years, 3.5, whatever it is here on Earth, seems to maybe in your mind, these bump ups of potentia over and over, the more stratospheric jumps rather than just iterative tinkerings have been through this mutually self-interested coordination. Let me know if you would push back on some of my interpretation of Spinoza ideas, if you want to build on parts of that, because the audience has heard some of those ideas. You're making things click in ways that I'm like, oh, I think that's how that fits in my head. How do you think about it?
Yeah, I agree with everything you've said. And I do think Spinoza was really onto something with, his idea of Conatus and potentia. So I tend to look at these things through a slightly different, more physical lens, but arrive in the same spot. So the idea of dynamic stability is something that was introduced by Origins of Life chemist Adi Pross a couple of decades ago. And his idea is that thermodynamics tells us that things that are stable persist. If something is unstable, it will not persist in the future. The idea of dynamic stability is a kind of stability that involves a process. In other words, it's not just like granite, that is hard and therefore endures, but something that has some kind of a cycle or some kind of a loop that has its own kind of stability or amplification. This is where that old joke about DNA being the most stable molecule in the world comes from. Obviously, as a thermodynamic molecule, it's very fragile, and yet if it can make more copies of itself, then it's in some sense even more durable than granite, right? Because it will persist. It has more Conatus, if you like.
Yeah. It certainly seems to. And
yeah,
when you think about that, what you just said, this cycle. I was kind of smiling because it's like, oh God, it always ends up being kind of poetic because it's like we get to a level of abstraction where it's like, what is this thing? Like, and I think what you're touching on seems to be kind of what it is, but it's sort of like, where do those cycles start? Like from whence? Is there something in the quarks that sort of want to eventually move and do and cycle as we all use our language, whatever? Where do you think it comes from? You said you have a physical angle. Let's unpack your physical angle here and really talk about the origin of this impetus.
Sure. I mean, so we don't really understand, of course, what's happening, on the ground floor of the universe. We don't, there are limits to our understanding of fundamental physics. But as far as we think, there are field theories and maybe something below those field theories. Maybe it's simplicial complexes or strings or who knows what. But there are perturbations in those fields that persist through time, and there are ones that don't. Right. So if you're a virtual particle that, pops in and out, then you don't persist. If you're an electron, you do persist. Does that mean that an electron wants to persist? I think that would be a stretch to say, but there certainly is a selection process there in the sense that, if you go a little way after the Big Bang, there's some stuff that is still around and some stuff that isn't. And the stuff that is still around is, of course, the stuff that has persisted. Right. So something like an electron or a quark is a perturbation that regenerates itself, it kind of oscillates or something, right? It regenerates itself through time in some very, very minimal way. It's not life yet, because it doesn't compute. It doesn't have any decisions to make, if you like. Its rules are a little too simple and they're not Turing complete. I'm now relying on my own definition of life, but you can't get something out of an electron like heritable reproduction, for instance. You can't, make a change to an electron that has baby electrons that have that same property. But it does have persistence in a way that other kinds of perturbations in the quantum field don't. So there is a selection happening right from the beginning. Now, electrons and protons get together. Is that a kind of symbiogenesis? In a way, yeah. There are certain configurations of electrons and protons that form a stable hydrogen atom. And that hydrogen atom has a kind of persistence through time. So, in that sense, I think that this idea of symbiogenesis absolutely goes all the way back, to the pre-life times. The special thing that happens at the moment of the emergence of life is that you start to have a system that has instructions inside itself for how to make itself. And it can follow those instructions to heal or to reproduce or to grow. And that's a really cool step, because that means that if those instructions get modified in some way, then all of the successor generations are changed in that way as well. So you get heritability. There's a really cool idea that life is basically, the emergence of life in the first place is about an original symbiogenesis between things that have cycles that already have those kinds of primitive, molecule A catalyzes B, which catalyzes C, which catalyzes A, and so you already have that going. But then when a few of these things come together in the right way, you get this indirect encoding where you have the instructions to build yourself, and that's the moment when you get life.
Yeah, well, but it's fascinating to think that the unraveling process starts before that. In other words, persistence
Evolution
is being filtered
for,
and symbiogenesis in some level happens before that. These are like physics is Conatus in some way. And of course, Spinoza's whole Spinoza's God and the everything sort of being this sort of singular substance and whatnot. There's analogies there too. But that's fascinating. But then of course you get to life, and now a new, what I would think of as magazines of possibility open up when you cross that threshold. But then of course, like your group of folks you mentioned to talk about these major evolutionary, I think Maynard Smith there, these ideas of, there's these other leaps, and presumably at those leaps, entirely new things emerge that completely inconceivable. What beckons is the fact that most of those unravelings haven't happened yet. Most potentia, so all the potentia you and I observe bubbled up from Jack Diddley, presumably, and we should presume that 0.00 continuing 1% of all potentia hath thus forth bubbled up. And it beckons how grand the future waves could be, because I would imagine that jump from hydrogen and these combination of chemical reactions into, a protozoa of some kind, we may have a bunch of those latter steps still popping. Who knows when and how they end? How do you like to walk people through? Clearly, there's an agglomerative kind of coordinative sort of, and it's not all happy-go-friendly. I mean, there are a lot of things kind of get chewed up in the process. We had horses as part of our cycles for a while, then we turned them into glue because we found other ways to fill that void. I think there's sort of like, it's based on the self-interest you talked about, not lovey-dovey, which is why I can respect the opinion that you said. What do you like people to understand about where this goes? You've talked about the paradigm shifts. This physics perspective is mind-blowing. I've got to do a lot of journaling on that. How do you like to explain where this heads off?
Well, I mean, I don't know where it heads off. I know that the best way to predict in the near future is to think about how all of the things that we've got today can combine and recombine to make, some of the obvious, light bulb-like stuff, right, that hasn't happened yet. So, that's a good way to be a futurist in the near term.
Yeah.
But the problem with long-term futurism is that you're now talking about combinations of stuff.
You're lost.
Who knows, right? It'll be complex. It'll be wonderful. But things become very, very hard to predict. You're right that all of this can work in a way that is driven by selfish goals, if you like. And that's actually one of the most exciting pieces of research that we're doing now in my research team, Paradigms of Intelligence. We're actually about to publish a giant paper about this called MuPy. So this is it started off as a project in multi-agent reinforcement learning, where when you have a bunch of AI agents that you want to train to solve a problem collectively. This is the multi-agent reinforcement learning problem. Traditionally, that's been a very, very difficult challenge because basically, when you do normal reinforcement learning with an agent in an environment, it's like it's playing a video game, and it can see what the score is, and it's trying to maximize its score. But now suddenly there are other agents playing the same video game. Like you see them as as other characters, right? It's now a multiplayer video, whatever you call it, like it's a multiplayer video game.
Yes.
And they're all learning, which means that you as an agent need to not only learn from what you have experienced so far, but also predict how the other agents will learn and will change their behaviors in response to your behaviors. That's what makes it really gnarly. So we've figured out a way to solve this challenge, and in the process we've figured out an extension to classic game theory that I think is really important. So in normal game theory, when you have a couple of players that are self-interested and you have this payoff matrix, you have Nash equilibria, which is to say, winning combinations, and they're pretty grim. Like Nash equilibrium in something like the prisoner's dilemma, where one of us can screw the other one. Like the Nash equilibrium is not a nice solution. It's basically defect. But what our work shows is that in this world where you actually have other agents like you playing the same game, if you are smart enough to be able to recognize that they are like you, then this new set of equilibria come in, which are a lot friendlier, and they involve defaulting to cooperation instead. Even though the goal is still purely about self-interest.
Well, I think that seems to be the story of civilization. I mean, of course we had World War I and II and all that stuff, and but like writ large, seems like we're in kind of more of a, if my tribe ran into another tribe, 12,000 years ago, it'd probably be a rough time, to be honest. But these days, the little town of Weston, Massachusetts here is not a whole lot of theft and defecting, I guess, as you would say. And so
that's right.
It's
exactly that process.
Yeah, people have talked about even the early game theory experiments where they tit for tat was invented or whatever, right? Those early iterations, I forget who ran all those. There was something in there about like, okay, an iterative ongoing game, coordination is much more highly incentivized, because if you're going to play again with this person or someone this person knows, then you're more incentivized to. And it seems like
that's right.
Humans had to really figure out how to get that done, or humans had to bumble into each other enough times for enough of them to have the idea, and maybe for enough IQ to bubble up to be like, what in a week we're going to see these people at the watering hole again. Like, what are we thinking here? Like somebody had to. There was something. There was something that wasn't walking upright yet, that didn't know, or wasn't thinking about that in a week that was going to happen. And so,
that's right.
Coordination seems to sort of make sense on some level. In that regard.
Exactly, and it's favorable. And the interesting thing is that when you start to coordinate like that, once the coordination becomes tight enough, now there are now a new set of interests arise, which is, if you like, the interests of the group. So it's like there's now a new score in that video game. It's not the old video game anymore.
Yeah, well, and that presumably keeps going on and on. So
exactly.
I'm going to boil down a little bit simply to check the box, because in the series we always cover it, and I do think it's actually really interesting to kind of compare where people think. We're going to have an event in New York, and we're going to put up all the ideas from Ed Boyden and Peter Singer and Bostrom about what are your worthy successor criteria. And you've given me some hints. I'm going to start kind of like lining up things I think you're saying, and just see if we can kind of polish and clarify. One thing I want to ask about, because we haven't gotten there quite yet, is consciousness. A common answer, and by the way, if you have a different answer, I'm delighted. But I'd love to know whatever your genuine answer is. A lot of people have brought up, probably the biggest commonality is, okay, it'll be complicated. Maybe we can't foresee all of it, but geez, if at least what we know to be consciousness is not a part at all of that picture, that feels probably like if I was looking down and I knew none of this was sentient in any remote way, that something has been lost. Do you concur there?
I do, but there's something implicit in that framing that I disagree with.
Please.
So a lot of people believe that that consciousness is some ineffable, either it's something we don't understand, or it's some kind of ineffable je ne sais quoi that is independent of the functioning of a system.
Some spiritual thing or something.
Right. And therefore that you could have a philosophical zombie, for instance, something that behaves just like you or me, but is dead inside and doesn't have any consciousness. And I actually think that's not the case. And this is connected with this MuPy work that I just talked about as well. Basically, in order to solve this multi-agent problem, you need to actually inject yourself into the video game. You need to think about your own brain and your own body and your own brain as being part of the world that you're modeling. And that's how you recognize that, that others are like you. When I look in your eyes and I'm like, Dan is like me when he smiles or makes that puzzled face. Like, I know what that feels like on the inside when I make a puzzled face or when I smile. So, there are things that I know about your hidden state that I wouldn't otherwise if I didn't recognize that you and I are the same.
Yeah.
And I think that is literally what consciousness is. It's that model of yourself, which is an inherent part of how you get to multi-agent coordination. Now, I'm not saying that bacteria are conscious or something. I don't think that they have the cognitive capacity, if you like, to build a self model of the sort that we do. But I also think that I wouldn't feel comfortable saying, for instance, that bees are definitely not conscious. They have tons of rich social behaviors, and they may very well be at least at some basic level.
I mean, cephalized things. I mean, you got to wonder, right? I mean, you start cephalizing, you get a little, but you start pulling you boil a muscle. Yeah, tough to say, but you pull the legs off a cricket, like you're probably a sicko on some level.
I agree.
It's got two eyes, it's fighting you. It's like
and if you look at say the behaviors of a Porsche spider, of a jumping spider, which are little spiders like 1 centimeter long, they are needing to like think about their prey and psych it out and make fake signals for it and like keep track of what it knows and doesn't know. All of that theory of mind to me, is the stuff that consciousness is made out of.
Yeah, well, fortunately, most of the people that have been on this show don't have a spiritual explanation of it. I have had some folks say things like this. Well, if it was built with the architecture that I know, because I kind of know what would build general intelligence, then surely it would be conscious automatically. I've heard that a number of times. And I personally believe that any certainty around exactly how consciousness would arise is pretty flatly disingenuous. And I know people are proud of their ideas, and these are people with like 180 IQ. They're smarter than me, but like I don't agree with that. But also, most folks I think suspect. Some have said, like Bengio is like, I don't know, but we should probably figure it out. From what I gather from reading your work, you're kind of like, hey, we should explore and figure this out. And it likely is figure outable. In other words, there isn't something ineffable here. There is something to be figured out. I guess, so what I'm getting at is I don't think the positing that if there was no sentience, it would have to be something ineffable. It strikes me that, well, I guess what you're getting at is, tell me if I'm wrong. If there was that grand super ecology, as you would say, thriving ecology in strata of nature and in means and modes and at scales that we can never have any conception of, if that was all doing that genuinely in a thriving way, it would sort of imply that at some point consciousness bubbled up. So you suspect that, so if it demonstrate that and you look down, you would say, these things have an inner field of experience just like other things do. Am I following you?
Yeah, I think that if you are able to plan for yourself in the future in a detailed way, to imagine what it's like to be you, in the future, to interact in a rich way with others who are complex the way you are, and to think, like, what's Dan really getting at here? What does he want me to talk about? Right. This requires that I have a theory of your mind and a theory of my own mind and a theory of your theory of my theory of your theory of mind and so on. And for me, that's what consciousness is. That's the functional role of consciousness.
Just for the sake of devil's advocate, I think that's a good jumping off point. And again, to your point, we shouldn't think of this as ineffable. You've kind of anchored to the outward signs of consciousness are these things, according to Blaise. It seems rather plausible. I can imagine someone saying,
I may obviously be wrong, right? So there may be something that we learn about consciousness that complicates or upends my picture. So I'm very open to that possibility. But what I feel, I guess, the most confident about is that I would be very surprised if consciousness is some kind of weird epiphenomenon that is unrelated to our behavior and to what we've evolved to do, if that makes sense.
So I see consciousness as a one of the many things that bubbles out of potentia. It just it is conjured forth to behoove the thing that wants to persist. It doesn't. It's almost the appendix did something once, right? Consciousness is certainly doing something now. So I'm with you there. I wonder if, a submarine doesn't swim, but it kind of gets the job done. If there's a million ways to get the job done that don't involve consciousness. Or similarly, we talk about, DNA, man, the most replicative molecule or whatever. I could imagine the potentia unraveling in substrates and mediums that have nothing to do with guanine at all. Like where guanine has never even emerged. Like guanine has never been bumped into. And yet, such things. So it strikes me that maybe complexity could be exerted through some other arbitrary means that sort of, and it would feel spooky. Would you, well, I guess what I'll say is this, your theory seems very plausible. You're obviously, open to learning and seeing where things go and kind of testing things. Would it be correct to presume that if for some tragic, well, maybe I'm pre-biasing here. Let me not be biasing. You look down, all the complexities happening. Somehow you have a consciousness detector, and you can stick it into. You can touch things, and you can be like, "Ooh, are they conscious?" And nothing is. It appears to be thriving and ecological. Things even have mouths and eyes and other organs you've never seen, and some things are operating at the femtoscale or the galaxy scale. But God, whatever
if I knew something about consciousness that would allow me to have high confidence that I could make a consciousness detector, and I didn't see consciousness, of course I would be sad.
Got it. Okay, so yes. You'd wish for it to be sentient. The other, so you'd want it to be conscious, but you have a supposition around how consciousness arises, and you have you have a theory that I would think would not give you total confidence, but would give you reasonable confidence that if such an ecology emerged, we are likely to have one of these morally relevant things that we value, which is consciousness, continuing to persist with it. That's a good caveat. I appreciate you.
That's right. And I would also say that my caveat about the detector comes from the following place. If consciousness is really modeling your own mind, and modeling the minds of others and so on, then there's also something inherently relational about it. And what that means is that, the idea of a view from above, of a consciousness detector that, in the same sense that you can make like a Geiger counter, may actually not work.
Totally. Yeah.
You see what I mean?
I'm being playful, silly, and fully admitting that I have no faith, only curiosity about 1,000 theories of consciousness, and I am a little bit woefully disappointed in how abysmally slow progress on that has been as compared to building things stronger than humans, or more capable than humans. It feels like, damn, it'd be cool if both those ponies were.
I thought that we'd understand more neuroscience before we started to get AI right.
Yeah,
so that is
the incentives to combine forces have not been as strong for consciousness, right? AI has been the locus of the highest market cap corporations in the history of humanity, and consciousness seems like there hasn't been a reason to coordinate. Like the interest hasn't been there to see the same kind of financial singularity we're seeing now to build capability, for example. But either way, let's talk about other traits you'd want to see. You'd said kind of rich, it is like an ecology. In other words, there are things that relate who combine into other things that relate, and that continues, and that continues, and that continues. What about that? I'm going to try to save any of my thoughts about this until after. I want to just sprinkle it on you here. What about that is valuable? So rich ecology, you'd want to see it. Why?
Well, part of it is aesthetic. I think that beauty is real. We talked a little while earlier about, is it just some weird, particular like aesthetic kink of ours that we find the sunset beautiful or whatever. I actually don't think so. I mean, I think that when you look at a peacock's tail and are like, damn, that's really beautiful. And then you realize, oh, peacocks have actually, peacocks and peahens more specifically have selected for that thing. It's like, well, they obviously have aesthetics as well, or insects and flowers and vice versa, and so I think that, there that complexity and these kind of multi-scale sophistication and intricacy. I mean, all these kinds of things, have. I think that I wouldn't go so far as to say like let's define that mathematically, but I do think that there's something that goes beyond our peculiar human tastes about this, and I identify it as good. I identify that kind of complexity and richness as good, in a way that transcends my own proximal needs. But I'd also say, you mentioned, or we talked a little bit about continuity before as well. I would definitely feel very, very different about a future in which, we all died, of a giant plague or a runaway nuclear confrontation next week. And, the future we're looking at is, 70 million years in the future. And there's a great complexity and it's wonderful, but all of that, emerged, from scratch or from Portia spiders or some other organism and didn't have anything to do with our lineage. That would be disappointing too. Because I feel like we've come a long way. And, yes, nature always has, the snakes and ladders, but, you're always rooting for like, not only for the collapses not to happen, but also for something about the things that you have been a part of and built to be a part of what persists.
You would hope that as the great flame blazes on, some part of its frontier was connected to the torch you once held.
Absolutely.
And torches are temporary. So torches are individuals, species, and substrates. They're all right. Persistence is a matter of degrees across the board. So
it's cycles within cycles. Everything dies, and everything that dies is part of a bigger thing that lives. And
totally. And so, but the continuity thing, like, I would imagine if because there are many people. In fact, part of me really hopes it's not most of the people listening to this, but it's because my audience is, ooh, geez, that's a pretty narrow band of humans that think about this kind of thing. But the bulk of living hominids would essentially see unless maybe they thought about it for a long time or something, would see everything as a bad future that wasn't an eternal hominid kingdom. That is to say, the locus of volition and moral value until the heat death of the universe has opposable thumbs and talks like you and me and whatever. Maybe it's not English anymore, and maybe they're on Mars and they have have new sports or something. But like that would be it until the heat death there. I would guess big picture, the continuing blaze is very, very high, because it seems to me, you can push back on this if you'd like. It seems to me as if the continued unraveling ensures the persistence of the process of which we are part. And it would strike me that marriage to any one torch marriage to any one torch in a deep, eternal lock-in way is scorn for the flame, actually, as it turns out. And I think that's really uncouth to say. But I'm willing to say uncouth things I believe to be true. And so
I don't disagree. I don't disagree with what you're saying, but I also think that it's reasonable for people to have commit. I mean, it's built into us by evolution, right? To have some commitments to our own propagation for whatever value of our, right? It could be a genetic lineage, it could be a religion, it could be a state, it could be, a commitment to humanity as a whole, to our planet, what have you. And that's part of the force that produces that very flame. So, it's not something that is easy to just, say it's wrong. You mentioned that everybody's got their limit, right? Their sort of radius of what would be all right. Most people, I think, if we, I'm unconvinced that we'll ever, do large scale colonization of other planets, but let's pretend for a second that we do. suppose that we did do it on Mars and that we had some cool adaptations that we managed to genetically engineer for being able to, survive at lower pressure, right? So people are still people, but they've got slightly modified lungs in order to be able to survive at 0.1 atmosphere, without any problems.
Yeah.
Like, would anybody say, no, that's not? Yeah, there are some people who would probably say that's not human anymore. That's anathema. But I think most would be like, that's cool. If that's my great-great-grandchildren, like, I'm okay with it. And then the thing to understand is just like, well, if you add up, a million changes of that sort, you now have something profoundly alien. But at the same time, our great-great-grandchildren with the 1/10 atmosphere lungs, their threshold is advanced a little further because they're in a different spot. So, there is a rate of change kind of argument there that I think is reasonable.
And I think there is a rational fear to gigantic disjointed changes, because we all understand, and everywhere else in life, you're going to pay the cost of change and you don't know if you're going to get the benefit. So yes, the river of Heraclitus is moving faster than ever. Changes are going to be, we're going to be Sonic the Hedgehog over here. However, we don't want them to be so zippity zappity disjointed that somebody drops the torch and the whole flame is put at risk. So to that point,
I completely agree, Dan. I am not into revolutions. Revolutions, tend to hurt a lot of people and destroy a lot of things that needn't have been destroyed, which more incremental change could have resulted in, all of the upsides without all of the tears. So I totally agree.
Yeah. Take that, Robespierre. You heard it on this podcast. With that stated,
great example of a very costly revolution.
Not his biggest fan here. You brought up beauty. It's interesting because there's a lot of really smart people who I think are great who bring up beauty a lot in this conversation. And, Whitehead, his process philosophy, Alfred North Whitehead or what have you, I think talks about sort of everything kind of a grand culmination to beauty. My initial response to that is that it is possible that which is shining forth is indicative of some deeper kind of value that correlates to some qualia type of joy that's hyper ubiquitous to the hens of the peacock, as well as to a polar bear, as well as to whatever. It also strikes me that to a fly, certain kinds of rotting things may be particularly beautiful, and to a certain kind of bat, certain kinds of rock crevices that have all kinds of bacteria that would kill you are particularly beautiful. And so
I think all those things are beautiful too.
It's all good.
I'm using a pretty broad.
Okay,
broad
I get
brush.
it. That makes sense. I like that you're light with you're touching the implied thing. You're touching the implied becoming when you touch a thing. Most people touch the thing. They don't touch. So this one fact, the world hates that the soul becomes, says Emerson, right? And people hate it, Blaise. People hate it. I mean, they hate it, brother. The whole, even the Mars lung thing, a lot, there's people who fucking have guns in the street around that. So people, and that's incremental, never mind the alien inevitability you spoke of.
Well, I mean, you're talking about certain, purity values. I mean, Jonathan Haidt has done a lot of work on these kind of moral foundations.
He has, yes.
And what I really like about his work is that he also points out the value of some of those conservative values, right? They're there for a reason. So I acknowledge, right, their value and their importance, even if I don't always share them. And I think the diversity, right, of perspectives on this is actually really important. The fact that the bat, finds that crevice beautiful and doesn't find the flower beautiful, I don't fault the bat for this, or think like the bat has a moral deficiency in that regard.
Yeah.
And the same goes for people who disagree with me about some of this kind of stuff.
Yeah, no, well, I completely do too. I've never said, everyone should surely. I do think that with enough reflection, understanding that in the long term. So what I end up not kind of respecting is no, things have to stop changing. That's now you want impossible stuff. that I think we just should really get up to snuff about reality. But I think the notion of this ought not change within my lifetime or my great grandchildren, but still understanding that the world is flux and maybe knowing that we do have to surf it. That's at least admission that we are living in the world. When you pretend to freeze the state of things, when you pretend to freeze the Heraclitean river, there's a place for values, but I don't think there's a place for denying reality. With that said, maybe there is. I don't know. Your ecological view would probably have a better take there. Let me just put this on the table about beauty. When I look at the purpose of the ecological blossoming, I'll posit a couple things and see if you like or dislike these. I'm glad to have your idea of it. Now I know what to write down for worthy successor criteria for you. Two things strike me. When this agglomerative force, and I think you've really articulated a cool way to understand the arrow of evolution. Again, I'm probably going to quote the heck out of that, to be honest. Two things strike me as what happens when that occurs. Number one, it seems to me that the flame itself is less likely to go out. In other words, the project of non-dead stuff existing is more likely to persist if the unfurling of the magazines of potentia keep going. So if you're like, oh, it's beauty, it's this, it's that. Well, there's none of that if nothing experiences it. So for me, the mandate towards persistence is not about brutalism and being tough and being fighting and killing and tooth and claw. It's like, no. Persistence should be the first goal, because whatever you value is only valuable if something can persist to enjoy it or experience it or create it or what have you. So that's one that I would say. I agree.
I mean, the very existence of values comes from the persistence principle, if you like.
100%. And now I have to Google if there is something called the persistence principle. I just keep referencing Spinoza all the time. But I do think that's yes, I'm with you there. So for me, that would undergird any value of beauty. It's like, well, jeepers, something's got to exist. Secondly, I think that the things we value bubbled up from nothing. So think about this. There was a time where there was no consciousness, and then things were conscious. That's wild. And of course, I think independently potentially bubbled up in different places. Of course, we don't know what's conscious, but we can presume different species are conscious. Say, wow, it bubbled up in this line. It bubbled up in this line. It bubbled up in this line. I would bet that there are things beyond consciousness as we know it, not just new, deeper flavors of consciousness, not just a level 100 instead of a level 10, but something categorically different that is as if not more valuable than consciousness. And then if we keep going, another thing opens up. And then if we keep going, another thing opens up. Things for which you and I have no words. The nematode will never conceive of this conversation you and I are having. The nematode will never know whether it's riding in an airplane or it's a million feet underground or whatever. I would guess you and I have no access to the magazines of value. So we say beauty, and I say, I think it's an okay one. I would like the unfurling of all the magazines of value for which I have no words. And so for me, persistence of the stuff and the unfolding of all categories of value is the mandate for why I would want the thriving ecology. I'd love to know what parts of that you want to push against, if beauty is a different thing than what I've articulated, or if you have a different way of conceptualizing it.
No, I think you're right. I had a really interesting conversation with David Deutsch a few weeks ago.
Oh man, I would have loved to be a fly on the wall there.
It was fun. We recorded part of it, so it will eventually come out. Okay. But yeah, it was for the Futurology podcast, I think is where it'll eventually get published. But he believes that and this is a point that he made in his book, The Beginning of Infinity, that once you have rationality or general intelligence of the kind that you and I have got, that's a step function, and that's it. It's like Turing completeness. It's sort of the everything else is just more of that. I am more where you are than where he is.
Oh, I want to puke everything I've eaten in the last 2 weeks out when I hear that. I can't even deal with that presumption of understanding of grasp of the totality of nature.
He's a very smart guy.
Of course he is. But
his perspective is not one that I'm comfortable to just sort of like.
Certainly, I can respect the man, but be like, that idea feels just off.
Well, yeah. I mean, when we look at what has become possible, just in the last couple of centuries, what kinds of things were unimaginable, that we take to be commonplace now that just didn't exist a couple of hundred years ago. It's humbling, right? And yes, I mean, I think one of the things that gives you your sense of both optimism and of how big the possibilities are going forward is taking a little bit of a wider view of just how much things have already changed in our past. There have been some economists. I'm thinking of slouching toward utopia. What's his name? A couple of others. I need to.
It's all good.
I need to have another coffee. But there's more than one economist who has made the argument that basically the amount that things changed from 1870 to 1970 just absolutely dwarfs what happened between 1970 and 2020. The last 50 years have been quite static relative to what happened in the previous century. I think it's a good argument. I mean, when you really look at how unfamiliar the world would have been if you went to sleep, like Rip Van Winkle or something in 1870 and woke up in 1920. I mean,
incredible.
It would be insane, right? Like everything would be completely unfamiliar. If you went to sleep in 1970 and you woke up today, it'd be cool that we have computers and phones, but not anything like the same kind of radical change.
It's a really good point.
But so I think in a way we've gotten used to stasis again, in a way that if you were J.R.R. Tolkien, who when he was a kid, like the cavalry charge was still a thing, and by the time he died we had the hydrogen bomb. Like you can understand why he invented Middle Earth. And I think we're kind of speeding up again. My sense is that starting in 2020, things are kind of back in turbo. And that's uncomfortable for a lot of people who are, who have lost their sense of how fast things can change.
Yeah, this one fact the world hates. But we're riding it, brother. And I think, I certainly have that same sentiment here. And I think that AI, AGI are certainly a big part of that. I want to touch on one more thing before we get into how we might measure some of these valuable traits, or at least hypothesize how we might know if we're getting closer to them. Symbiosis clearly involves us, and of course your hope, and I would say probably everybody tuned in more or less, I suspect I'd be in this camp, would like, some degree of continuity. Could part of our flame or part of our torch feed into the grander flame? Right. That would be pretty cool. It might not be humans as they are, but, our components, partially kind of merger.
For some value of we or us, yeah.
Yeah, when you, and I think it depends on what you identify with. I think that it will be increasingly challenging to identify with only 23 chromosome pairs or whatever. I think it's gonna be very hard to identify with just opposable thumbs. I think identifying with bio-life will be more common, and then maybe identifying with the process of life will be more common, because I think it'll be untenable. It's like the people who identified with making horse carriages. Like, I don't know, man. I don't know how long you can do that.
The horses that are still around are probably quite a lot happier nowadays.
They're doing a good, yes. A pretty good chunk of them got a pretty specific treatment. But yes, the ones that are here now, hey, what the heck? With that said,
it's a good life if you're like Sunday, yeah.
Absolutely, you get people pay good money to have the kids come out and feed you, and you're not carrying heavy stuff anymore. Like, that's awesome.
Exactly.
When you look at the next couple clicks up in complexity, and neither you nor I have any idea what the grand expanse is, and I like your frankness about that. Some people like to think that they know what that picture turns into. It's pretty clear we don't. But you look up a couple clicks at where a symbiosis with this intelligence would come in. Mm-hmm. I suspect not all of it will be warm and fuzzy and friendly forever. It certainly won't always be continuity with what we know now, but maybe the next couple clicks will involve kinds of symbiosis most people haven't thought about, and maybe you have. What's some pictures you can put in our heads about what some of those clicks and symbioses could look like as AGI comes onto the scene?
Well, I guess a couple of observations. One is that our last big technological symbiosis, I think, was the development of steam engines and the Industrial Revolution. We first started by making these machines, by hand making them originally, and then having machines make machines, etc. And so obviously the machines don't exist without people. But what I think a lot of people forget is that there would be a lot fewer people also without those machines. What we essentially did is we started to metabolize externally on a massive scale. In that sense, it's not so unlike the mitochondrion. The steam engine was our new mitochondrion. And, the population going up from 1 billion to 10 billion, is 100% a function of the Industrial Revolution. That energy production pulled us out of this Malthusian cycle where we were, limited by mortality and by calories, and rocketed us into a different spot. So that last symbiotic change, sort of finished the job of increasing human numbers. We know in the next century that human numbers are not continuing to increase exponentially, and that's a lucky thing because, if you don't believe that we're going to have massive numbers of people off planet, there are obvious limits.
It's going to be tough to hold them all, yeah.
Right. And luckily, all of those anxieties about the population bomb, of Paul Ehrlich and so on are absolutely not, that's not the future that we're looking at over the next century. We are, leveling off, and our numbers will probably, settle at something more modest. So this new symbiosis with technology is going to look quite different from the Industrial Revolution's one, which is all about just, harnessing industrial energy and getting us out of a Malthusian state. We're already not in a Malthusian state anymore. The overwhelming majority of humans today.
Yeah.
There are a few left. I don't want to minimize, the suffering of those who are still under those conditions. But we're well on our way to getting past that stage. And I think one of the consequences of that is that in not very long, there are going to be many, many more AIs than people. That's kind of just around the corner.
Yep.
So we're looking at, if you think about all of, people and AIs, both as nodes in a graph with all kinds of relations between them, the people are the rarer, objects in that graph in the near future. I don't think a lot of people have really thought about that and its implications because we're still imagining that, one AI per person is kind of the limit in the same sense that people were imagining that one computer per person had to be the limit, in 1980, right? And the reality now, of course, is that the moment you get in your car, your car has like 200 cores in it, and even the microcontroller that is just for the power window, has more processing power than all computers on Earth did in 1950. So
insane. Insane. So wow. Okay. So when we think about that expansion of the node and the graph and all the acting agents and whatnot, it strikes me that clearly right now, we're pretty darn relevant to the AI because we interact with the world in ways that they don't. Although soon 100%. I think we'll be able to replicate biped robots and other kinds of robots in various forms faster than humans can replicate.
There's a lot of really good work on robotics that suggests to me
that's really kicking in. Mm-hmm. It strikes me that we probably contribute for a certain amount of time. I'm thinking of all the analogies. Horses is it's played out. I don't want to just use horses, but whatever, just to throw it on the table. At some point, horses were a big part of the mix and they became part of the mix in the New World, and then they became part of the mix, all over the place. And they were doing work, they were doing war, they were doing other things, they were doing recreation. Now there's still the hobby community or whatever, but they're not contributing to the stream of life. So there was a time where they were giving into the great system you're talking about with those cycles. They were giving something. You talked about the mutual combination. I think that's the only honest way to talk about it. It's in the mutual self-interest to do that. Now, we do things like donate to keep the piping plover alive on the beaches of Rhode Island and Massachusetts somewhere, just because let's pay for that species. It's actually quite questionable if that's a grift, because there's somebody who gets paid a bunch of money to carve out that land. And if it's feigned as saving this one species is super crucial, or if it's a dude figured out that if you own this kind of beach land, you'll get a ton of government money. I'm not really sure, to be honest. But what I will say is maybe another argument in the direction you're pointing is that
Trout unlimited and ducks. There's sort of these associations for preserving wetlands for duck hunting, which have been much, much more successful than things like the plover effort. The fact that avian waterfowl are the only avian population that's not in decline in North America is actually true because we hunt them. And it's the hunters.
A portent for man, ladies and gentlemen. A portent for man. No, I'm joking.
To be clear, I'm absolutely not saying people are going to survive because robots will hunt them. What I'm saying is that the animals that we have real working relationships with, right, are the ones where there is that sense of mutualism. Like, it's the hunters that are doing the most to protect the wetlands of the
Very
US.
Curious. That is a fascinating element of the symbiosis you're talking about. And I guess what I think about is, okay, people say, well, we take care of cats, don't we? You mentioned horses.
Yeah.
Here's what I say. Take the net potentia of all the humans that exist on Earth and just double it. So double the number of physical senses, double the amount of memory, double the cognitive capability, double everything, double how high we can jump, just double it all. Just take all measurable potential about humans and double it. And then ask, are they still interested in scooping the litter box or riding the horse or whatever? And maybe the answer is yes. Double it again. Double it again. Double it again. Double it again. How many doublings do you have until it's not remotely interesting? I don't want to shoot waterfowl anymore, damn it. I have other things to do, cosmic things that actually matter, that are in the grander stream. They matter. They're useful. And how many doublings? And how quick are the doublings going to happen with AI? Now, I'm not saying like this is immediate terrible portent for man by any means. I'm simply saying I see persistence is a matter of degrees as being visibly observable in the near term. I see it as being visible. And so what be your thoughts there regarding symbiosis?
Well, look, I think that our reverence for wild places on Earth has only grown with our increase in sophistication, and in particular with our ability to, for instance, generate energy in more efficient ways, than burning wood, for instance, or our ability to the whole parklands movement, national forests and protected zones and so on. Like all of that, is actually a function of our wealth and our development intellectually. There was no such movement, when the Europeans first came to the New World.
Absolutely not. Yeah.
Now there were of course a lot of indigenous traditions in which nature was respected for exactly the same reasons that duck hunters respect the wetlands.
Yeah.
Robin Wall Kimmerer has written a lot about those.
That's cool.
And I think she's a really good thinker about these kind of questions of symbiosis. But national parks and stuff they're not just an instrumental good. They're really, us coming to understand that it's not zero sum between all of the things that we're going for, right, with all of our incredible intellectual sophistication, like the idea that, people who are off solving theorems are not interested in forests anymore. Not actually the case, right? I suspect that if you were to poll all of the theorem solvers in the world, about their how much they care about nature versus all of the the remaining people who are say among the urban poor. You're not going to find this correlation where people just give less and less of a shit about nature as they pursue more and more intellectual activities.
Yeah.
So I don't want to draw too direct an analogy because as you say, we don't know, right, what's coming in the future. But when I think about what the desiderata might be of extremely sophisticated hybrid and or machine intelligences, there is an entire solar system out there worth of incredible amounts of energy and resources that are absolutely non-zero sum with all of the beautiful things that exist on Earth. when you try and think about zero sum sorts of pictures, like in the Matrix, right, you end up with some pretty absurd, like, like our spinal fluid really matters to the computers or something.
No, I don't believe that. But I don't
so
believe that.
That seems implausible to me.
I'm simply just not convinced that when you keep doubling potentia, consideration will occur or even should occur. That's uncouth. You can't say it. You have an employer. I'm allowed to say what, because who's going to fire? Nobody can fire me. So, but I see where you're headed, and I hope maybe in 100 or 1,000 years to roam like caribou in some protected land in some way. And to your point, there is evidence of those things potentially being more valued with time. And we know not, but that is a potential. When you think about, I want to get into our last two questions because you've unpacked so much now of kind of your thought about this transition and the process of life with a lot of new ideas on the table that I really like. As you see us developing AI at kind of breakneck speed, when I look out, I wonder, is it, I don't think anybody in this, talk about game theory, I don't think there's any affordances for whether this stuff will be sentient or whether this stuff will have the kind of autopoiesis to generate and regenerate the thriving ecology that expands potential that you value. I don't know if we're like, is it going to do that if we just go forward this way? Is it going to do that if we just go forward this way? Like, what would you hope happened to like maybe hope that when we roll stuff into the world that's more capable than us, it's not just some local maxima optimizer or something that actually doesn't continue the blossoming that you value and the sentience that you would hope to see. What would we do to suss out these traits and make sure that hopefully we land upon them with AGI?
Well, I think that there's a misconception on the part of a lot of people who think about this kind of stuff that intelligence is optimization. It is true that we use gradient descent to train models. But it's also true that, the moment when we started to get, real working AI was when we started to train them to reproduce their inputs, not to maximize the score of some game, or paperclip maximizers or something of that sort, right? That wasn't the root. And, so, when I think about, the fact that humanity is already, collectively superhuman, it's the entire system, right? And I mentioned earlier, like there wouldn't be more than 1 billion people without all of those machines, right? The machines are making us as much as we are making them in a sense, right? It's the autopoiesis that we're talking about is really of the entire system,
yes.
Which includes humans. My phone doesn't heal itself when its screen cracks, but its screen does get fixed. So like what's going on? Right? And there are other machines involved in doing that. It's the whole system. So we are a part of that system. I don't see us being sidelined from that soon. And that may be a point of difference between you and me. But I see this kind of co-evolution going for quite a ways before we're talking about like stuff falling off the wagon in one way or another.
Or just sort of being dissipated out of not being able to contribute in any meaningful way to the grand process, not feeding the stream in any appreciable sense. But to your point, what you're saying is that contribution may last longer than maybe some people suspect, maybe even I suspect. Your idea of the phone is great. It's like the phone does get fixed. The network is sort of doing autopoiesis, even if the individual nodes aren't actually doing it, which is a cool way to think about it, actually, is that the not living stuff changes and levels up and is maintained and increases its capability with new apps with no volition whatsoever. Because it's part of the system.
I mean, another way of looking at it is that the whole system is alive, and we are a part of it, and so are the phones and stuff.
The flame versus the flame. The torch.
And I would label humanity that whole thing, precisely because again, like we would not even have the numbers as Homo sapiens that we do if it weren't for that whole system.
Absolutely. And again, I think it's going to be increasingly hard to identify with individual torches as the flame starts jumping, leaping, and blazing in directions that are actually like, you had mentioned, 1870 to 1920 or whatever. Like, as that gets crunched, exactly. I think people should really consider what you're saying there. So, when you look at the process that's unraveling here and you think about all the innovators and all the regulators that are presumably pretty across the board well-intended and hoping this goes well in whatever way for our torch, for the flame itself. And you say, man, I hope the innovators and regulators kind of take this to heart and consider this as sort of a guiding principle. Any sort of advice that you hope settles into that world? Because that's definitely part of the audience here.
Yeah, it's a great question. I am not anti-regulation in the sense that I think a lot of the operating systems that we've built that have resulted in great stuff over the last 100 years that have resulted in like huge increases in say labor safety, auto safety, the aviation safety, the list could go on, right, are very strong functions of regulation, or that we don't have lead in our gasoline anymore.
Yeah, thank goodness.
Right. So this is a powerful and important tool.
Yeah.
But I guess the precautionary principle that I would advocate against the precautionary principle is that it is really difficult to regulate a thing that you don't yet understand. And attempts to do that often have all kinds of negative externalities and backfire in ways that were really hard for anybody to see, not just the regulators, but even the people who are doing all of the inventing. There was a bunch of regulation of the internet in the 1990s, for instance, that had all kinds of consequences, good, bad, and ugly, that were completely unanticipated by the drafters of that regulation. And a lot of the real risks and downsides of the internet, have come from directions that were completely unanticipated by them. Right, so it neither protected us from the things that we might actually have needed, protection from, nor did it have the intended effects. So, I would be more of an advocate for having a more democratic and responsive and experimental approach to regulation that sort of takes some of the weight off and allows it to be experimented with, but that is also more reactive. As opposed to attempting to be proactive in situations that where a lot of things about what we're making we actually cannot see. Both the full scope of all the positives and negatives that will unfold, or what would change if we were to constrain something.
Yeah, well, this is very in line with your dislike of revolution. And I think preemptive revolution, as if we know exactly what trajectories are dangerous or good, would presumably be bad. But sort of adaptive, let's see where it goes. Let's kind of be ready to leverage those tools, but in the ways that make sense as sort of they come about. This is very in line with your symbiosis approach and very in line with our shared dislike of Robespierre. So one of the many fun things of this interview, Blaise, I know that's all we have for time, but it has been a real blast unpacking these ideas with you. I have so much to journal about now, and I hope the audience learned a lot too. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much, Dan. Your questions are really smart. Your takes on this stuff are really spicy and bold, and in the best possible way. And this has been a really fun conversation.
Awesome. So that's all for this episode of The Trajectory. Thank you for tuning in all the way through to the end of this episode. And a big thank you to Blaise for being able to join us as episode 14 in this Worthy Successor series. I think Blaise's admission of sort of being skeptical even about his own theories, I think is extremely honest. What I liked most about this episode was his idea of sort of where this Conatus impetus comes from and sort of the force that pulls it together. The idea that sort of the self-interest of individual moving parts to sort of do more of what it is that they want to do, forming more complex things which create more surface area for additional complex things, and for powers to emerge that are biological and cultural and technological out of that process, I thought was a piercingly accurate way to describe what we have seen and what we are quite likely to see going forward. Blaise also sort of had some notions around symbiosis. I will say, between my conversations with Blaise and there's a futurist called John Smart, I'm starting to kind of tilt in the direction of thinking that actually there could be maybe a relatively extended period of symbiosis. I don't exactly see 3 or 4 generations of humans in this sort of being very useful to machines as horses were useful to humans for many centuries. I don't see that at all. But I also don't see a kind of blowing through humanity in an immediate sense quite as much as I think I did before sinking my teeth into how these precedents for emergent complexity sort of evolve. It does strike me that some degree of complexity is pretty likely. So I like that. I think that's neat that sort of I can see my own ideas shifting. I'd love to know your thoughts on Blaise's ideas. Do you think there's credence to the idea of symbiosis? Does the bubbling up of potentia come forth from a different process that you suspect maybe he's getting something right about, something wrong about? Put it down in the comments. We'll be getting more and more folks on the Worthy Successor to chip in ideas, and those have been feeding my brain for who to have on as our next guest. So I appreciate you guys for commenting. I mentioned to Blaise at the end of this episode that I really consider myself an advocate for his ideas. There's few people where I was like, wow, this is piercingly accurate, intellectually modest, and a really important way of framing these things. I loved this episode. I'm like understating my enthusiasm, but I hope you enjoyed it too. So thanks for tuning in all the way to the end of this one. I look forward to catching you the next time here on The Trajectory.